We're going to talk about a very topical issue, the whole issue of employee activism. And we're going to do that in the company of John Higgins. And John will speak shortly, but just let me briefly introduce him to you. So John Higgins is the research director at The Right Conversation. He's been working with me for a good 12 years now, since we set this business up. In parallel, he's also a researcher for a living. He's done a lot of work through Ashridge Hult. And you may know John through his work with his co-collaborator, Dr. Megan Reitz. And they in particular have done lots and lots of work around what you might loosely call organizational dialogue, which is how do we speak to each other in organizations, and a lot of work around speaking truth to power, a best-selling book around that, which has just gone into its second edition, countless articles. So I think we're in the company of someone who's done an awful lot of thinking around this in a much broader sense. And in particular, John has spent the last 2 or 3 years with Megan looking at this whole issue of employee activism. And very shortly, we'll get him to talk to that. But John, very warm welcome to you this morning. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts on this. So there you go.
Well, I look forward to it, and no doubt we all have points of difference. I'd be very surprised if we didn't, because in your work, you're actually engaging with people who are doing it for real. I tend to do it at one step removed. Yeah.
Okay. So between us, we'll kick this around, and as I say, your thoughts, comments, interjections via chat would be really most welcome, because we have a richer dialogue in that way. So from our perspective of The Right Conversation, as John's alluded to, we spend our life working with leaders on dialogue, how they talk, the sort of organizational cultures they create. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a modern leader, and how do you engage with people? And one of the things we have undoubtedly heard more and more of in recent years is this idea of employee activism, this idea of people wanting to talk about things which were perhaps not traditionally on the corporate agenda. And it presents interesting and thought-provoking questions to be discussed inside organization. What do we do? What do we not do? So I think it's a timely thing to be looking at. So with that, let me start by asking John to give a bit of context to all of this. John, are you happy maybe to kick off by saying or describing what do you mean, or when we say employee activism, what are we talking about here? Just so that we're clear that we're all talking about the same thing. What is it?
Well, if we're clear at the end of my description, then I've failed, because one of the big things is that activism is in the eye of the beholder. We did it as part of the original research. It goes back 5-6 years now. We did the very traditional word cloud. And when you say the word activism, it can mean anything from eco warrior to shareholder activist to hippie Marxist. It really is all over the place. And I will give you sort of a synopsis of the definition that Megan and I came up with. But the point is, when you are talking about this within a workplace, people carry their own definitions in with them. Whatever you tell them is the definition. And one of the most important perspectives to give some emotional heft behind that sort of nice painting of this is a broad church is the work of someone called Ruchika Tilsham. I met 6-9 months ago, and she has a lovely perspective, which is what to you or I is a matter of corporate hygiene might be to one of your employees a matter of fundamental human rights. And what therefore to you is, we've got to have a nice policy here, is no, if you don't have something around here, you are burying me. And so again, that different emotional intensity explains why a lot of this catches senior leaders off whack, because they are uninformed as to how much weight this word has. Now, so what's a sort of a working definition? It is about voices of difference that disrupt the status quo. And that is the point. They require people in positions of power to examine whether they should redistribute who has what voice in the organization and who they pay attention to. And so it is a fundamental challenge to the organizational status quo.
Okay, and just on that, John, just to be clear, so is that in relation to issues which come from without, if you like, social issues, trends, Gaza, Black Lives Matter, or does that also apply to people within companies who want to challenge the way a company organizes itself, unionizing issues? We've seen them in various companies around the world. Do you also define that as activism, or is it just when societal issues suddenly creep into the corporate agenda?
Well, it's both. And again, the way you're framing it is this idea that somehow organizations sit apart from and have a choice as to whether societal issues walk in or out. And the point is that as soon as you employ people, you are having societal issues coming in through the door the whole time anyway. And the risk of getting a little bit esoteric is that actually what we're in the midst of is possibly a renegotiation of what an organization's license to operate is. We have lived through a sort of a more or less a consensus, the Friedmanite consensus, the idea that an organization, particularly in the private sector, is there to produce good shareholder returns, and broadly social obligations are taken care of by others outside of the organizational remit. That whole thing is currently up for debate, and I've been shot at by both sides as being a woke warrior for saying other perspectives should be taken into consideration, and by activist voices I'm viewed as a lackey of the status quo for suggesting that it's quite legitimate in certain businesses not to pay attention to certain issues.
Okay.
And just one of the things, and we'll get onto this later, is that for organizations, there is an infinite number of issues out there. And as soon as it becomes more permeable, a lot of organizations are, if they do make a stand on something, let's say we're going to take a positive stand on certain rights of certain groups, you immediately get it in the neck for then not standing up for other groups. And it is this real experience of, can you control the narrative? And actually, dealing with the fact that you are not going to be all things to all people, and you are going to get it in the neck. And I'll just do one example of that, Dick, is I was speaking to the head of a very big institution, and the whole area of protected characteristics. And when you're talking about this area, you're walking on eggshells the whole time. And in this particular thing, I'm going to talk about women's rights and trans rights. And this particular guy, he was head of HR, and he said every time he produced a policy about women's rights, he would get it in the neck from the trans rights people. And every time he produced a paper or a policy on trans rights, he'd get it on the neck from the women's rights. This was very much, you could say at one level, this is an internal organizational issue, but of course it was in response to what was happening in the wider world.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you. So, obviously, if we look around, we see a lot of this at the moment, and the papers are full, probably on a weekly basis, of companies struggling or being talked about in some shape or form with this issue as the backdrop. From your perspective, and from the research you did, and you might just want to explain what the research was and how you've come to your views, but what's driving this now? Why are we seeing more of this today than perhaps we have in the past?
Well, in terms of, let me just say, in terms of where this research came from. So Dick mentioned earlier, so this drew upon, for me and for Megan and for Dick, the notion of employee activism is a subset of the whole wider issue of speaking truth to power, which was again this whole notion of how do you actually encourage voices of difference to be heard within your organization. And it was trying to say we need something more than whistleblowing. And people became interested in the research into speaking truth to power came back with things like the VW emissions scandal. And it is this notion of whatever is going on in the organization that is going to come back to bite you is already known by somebody. And it is always this idea is, the question is, why wasn't it becoming public knowledge within the organization before it became public knowledge elsewhere? And it's this idea that, these issues are permanently there, and your culture reveals the extent to which you take seriously your collective intelligence. Now, firms have been going on about things like you bring your whole self to work, we need to become more creative. And it is this idea of firms almost like to quite manage what they mean by that. And the point is that as soon as you want creativity, as soon as you want people's wholeheartedness and not just to turn up to do the necessary hours, you're going to invite more of their complexity as personalities. And this, if I was looking at firms are aware, all the cliches, desperately competitive environments, they need any trick they can do, and that means they're the old cliche, your greatest resource are your people, but people are awkward so-and-sos. And it's also this idea that people have great strengths, and the greater the strength, they'll show up with a terrific weakness as well. And one of my favorites in the leadership field is that it's now talked about spiky leadership. And for too long, we had these idealized competency matrices where everybody was meant to be some combination of the Christ or Buddha, and you're going to be both entrepreneurial and loving and giving, and combine the two. Very few of us are like that. And it is this question of how do we work with the messiness of people in order to tap into their creativity so that we don't get sideswiped by something that they know that they haven't spoken about. So in terms of why this has become an issue now, there is this thing about organizations have to compete.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they are aware that they have to tap into people, and that the technology, of course, has completely changed the extent to which they can control the narrative and control what people say about them. And there's also, Dick does a lot of this on societal shifts, is that the generational shifts, the expectations of employers is changing as well. So Dick and I are a generation which can by and large be seen as much more compliant, I would say, deferential even to authority figures. And we have now got a generation which is much less deferential. And that might also be to do with the fact that career opportunities are much less secure. I mean, I started in work and I could more or less guaranteed if I played the game, I'd have a good job in 10, 15 years time. That is no longer the case.
Yeah.
And I realized as I said that, of course, is that I've made a number of cultural sweeping generalizations. So one of my favorite ones, I'm speaking very much from a global north attitude towards, employees as citizens, bringing their whole citizenship into the workplace so that we can compete better. One of the organizations I interviewed with, I then was chatting to the chief executive off the record, and he said, you should be aware that if you looked at our shareholding, you'd see that a fairly major country in the East had a big chunk of us. And our HR department is actually the Communist Party of China. And now they have a somewhat different attitude towards speaking up and employee activism. And even away from the drama of that, I remember in one of our inquiry groups, someone talking about, in Singapore, again, what in the UK or the US would be just viewed as normal would be in Singapore be viewed as a very regressive antisocial act. And again, the cultural sensitivity of activism is there as well. And I just want to make one more example of that before I go on.
Yeah.
Which is, we had an example of I was tracking an organization that does a lot of work in the field of FGC, female genital cutting, and I noticed that I used FGC rather than FGM, and that's a loaded thing in itself, in West Africa. And their funders were coming from a Nordic country, and the Nordic country wanted the funding to be LGBTQI compliant, and they were going to send auditors down to check. Now, another charity had just done that 2 weeks beforehand, and their offices had been burnt down because the cultural norms in Ghana were somewhat different from the Scandinavian country in the form of and the degree to which you can speak freely about these issues, wildly different. And again, this is one of the things, as soon as you get into the activism, you're into the extent to which corporates can extend universal norms. And again, the more self-referencing an organization is, the more it will assume that you can roll out and that there is a one-size-fits-all approach.
Okay. Let's come back to some of these response options, because I think it's an interesting point. Clearly, can you impose something from the top across something which is as varied as a multinational institution? So clearly, I think we need to come back to that. Can I just press you a tiny bit more on what's driving all this? We've got a few things on the screen here. Obviously, you mentioned generational shifts. We've clearly got the technology and social media world, which kind of fires people up and allows them to form sort of, you know, online dialogues where people get very involved and very agitated and worked up. There's also something around the top thing you mentioned, which is this lack of trust in institutions, that they won't do it. So maybe we need to step up. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know this whole point, and I talked to it in my talks, this trust deficit in society. We don't trust government, we don't trust the media, we don't trust big corporates. We need to do this ourselves. So how do you read that? Is that something that came out in the research, or?
Well, it's it's the extent to which, you know, will I be heard is the first place. And again, one of the pieces I'm just running through, I think one of the key bits of research, and it goes back to the truth to power, is that senior people genuinely believe they know more than they do. If you ask senior people, are you in touch with what the kids in your company think about life in general, they will say, we're very well informed. Then you go and ask the next generation down, do you think your leaders are informed with what matters to you? And the answer comes back, not so much. And it is this, the trust is really about an understanding gap. And I mean, it's one of the most difficult things I find I have to do, which is, how do you tell a senior leadership group they know less than they do? Because I think part of the trust issue comes from senior leaders overestimating how in touch they are with the world. And it's just ordinary. It happens all the time. And I was just reminded of that lovely quote by Alistair Darling. He wrote in his autobiography just after he'd left government, when he'd been working for Gordon Brown during the financial crash. And he had this quote of, people could only tell Gordon what Gordon could bear to hear. And it is so often the case. And that whole sense of, for me, trust is a function of, you know, relational proximity. Do I have relational connection? Does this person know me? Can I have an ordinary conversation with this person? And I mean, there was a lovely senior copper I remember talking to, and he said, you can't have the big conversations till you have the little ones. And the point is that we've so much replaced personal connection with surveys and spreadsheets and numbers that we've been continuously undermining the relational connection, the sense of seeing each other as human beings. Dick, you talk about it in your work, and you know I do as well, which is Martin Buber's work, and you know the extent to which we treat people as things. It's I-it relating versus I-thou relating. And we got, I mean, the whole thingification of people, I think, has accelerated enormously, and that is so enabled by the technology, because it means that, you know, I want my people in spreadsheets. I'm monitoring their every moment. And it is that thing of people installing software so that they can track, you know, what people are doing when they're working at home, because the instinctive thing is, we don't trust you. And again, the temptation is, in order to spy and control, which is what the employee may feel like it, whereas the leader will say, I just want to make sure that I'm getting a fair bang for my buck. But again, so
just on this trust issue, because I think it is an interesting one as it relates to organizations. So many of you listening, you'll be familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is the thing that tracks who people trust and who they don't trust. And it comes out every year. And unsurprisingly, but interestingly, the trends are that the trust in public institutions is collapsed. And I think none of us are surprised by that. Governments, the media, politics, all of that, unsurprisingly, people are doubting. And we've only got to look around Europe or anywhere in the world to see why that might be the case. But in parallel, there seems to be a greater expectation from people that organizations start to fill that space, that they step into these issues and don't say that's not our problem, that's the politicians. People are going, no, you're powerful institutions. You, I think, are expected to do something about this. And that takes us, I think, into the responses that maybe are open to organizations when these issues hit. And I wonder, John, if I kind of if you could talk to this, which is this range of responses that are open to leaders of organizations when activist issues start to bubble up, be it Gaza, be it Black Lives Matter, be it whatever it may be, the war in Ukraine or climate change. What if I'm sitting at some senior level? Did the research show were the different responses that people came up with, and kind of how do you read those? And I find this dial here as we talk to it quite interesting. Just to summarize that, so do you maybe just want to talk through that, and then we can kind of go off there?
Certainly, and it's the informing bit of this is to have no response is as political an action as to have a response. So it's the idea that sitting on the fence is not an option.
Right.
And so
and is that still the default for many people still? Well, we don't do politics in this organization.
Well, again, I'm just thinking one of the references in terms of one of the examples we had up earlier was Coinbase. And again, that was an example where they said, we want people to be laser focused on the business. And I think a whole load of people promptly left. And again, it's this own notion that businesses can operate without reference to changing norms in society.
Right.
Although in the States, you've got this interesting pattern where you've got sort of blue and red companies emerging. So companies which are of a more Republican bias attract more Republican employees, and more Democratic or progressive attract progressive employees. So you've got a fascinating sort of macro divide within the employment market as well.
Right.
But let me come back. So these were based upon when we all the people we talked to, this is the range of responses that we saw. And within any organization, it would fall into a number of these categories. Now, the one that's very interesting to start with is the non-existent. And this we genuinely came across. We spoke to senior leaders who said, are you concerned with employee activism? And they just looked blank. Black Lives Matters, Me Too had no impact on them at all. And it was, again, my suggestion would be that's quite a risky position to be in, because what that means is you are going to be blindsided by suddenly an issue that you had just not on your radar at all. So it's quite a high risk position to be in.
The non-existence is essentially denial. It's not an issue.
Yeah. So it's denial.
Yeah.
The next one is suppression. And this is where we kill it. And actually, we've had a recent example of this, which is with Google. I think it was in April, May. So a number of their employees did a sit-in. And now, if I was advising the employees, to do a sit-in is a very aggressive act and not a very sophisticated way of trying to shape an organization's stand on something. This was around the Gaza situation. A week later, they were all fired. So suppression. Now that I would say again that was an X-ray of the corporate culture, because you're saying, if you step out of line, we will fire you. So you're thinking about what are the, if I was, Dick, if we were let's say in the business of selling people, how to become more skillful in corporate dialogue, I would, I want to sell something to Google, because it would to say, what you have done is you have got some potentially what could be seen as clumsy employees who feel very strongly about something, which rather than that's a sign of there is energy and enthusiasm, and they care enough about something to bring it to the corporate attention. They brought it to attention in an incredibly crass way, but there's energy there. So how do you engage with the energy? But their choice was, we're going to squash it. So if I was thinking about how to ensure a culture of corporate secrecy and issue avoidance, Google would be a masterclass. We also did some follow-ups after there were a number of their employees, there was a sort of complaining about sexism, which is widespread within the tech industry. And again, nearly everyone of the women who had complained about sexism in the industry had left the company. This was back in 2018. So again, suppression. Again,
there's some history there. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. There is history. Again, the culture persists. And again, it's one of these things as these actions are the things that people remember. You can have all the lovely value statements, all the, bring your whole self to work, we want your creativity, we want your thing. What people will notice is, but the last time someone did that, this happened. And that, by the way, will live on for decades and beyond the life of a particular chief executive.
Okay.
The third one going around the dial, and this is one of the most popular ones, is facadism. We'll just say, we'll put a nice statement up on the website, which says, we are in favor of this or that. And an example of this, coming unstuck was I listened to an interview with a manufacturer of snowboards during the China Winter Olympics. And he was asked, are you aware that the snowboarding activities are taking part on Uyghur territory? And he said, no. And he said, and are you aware that on your website, you have a statement which is saying, we are an active supporter of human rights? And so again, what that was that actually they weren't an active supporter of human rights. They were a very good snowboard manufacturer. But it is this thing of they thought that they could just say one thing and no one would track them down. And again, if we're looking at what's changing is the mismatch between what is said and what is done is now out there in the open.
Right.
So that's facade.
And is that quite a common response? Sorry, is it in your research? Is this, because obviously it's an easy and a tempting one. It says we've acknowledged the issue, we've said some good words about it. Let's move on. Nothing to see here. Move along.
Well, and it's a sensible thing as well. I was with a group yesterday. They were saying, but this, there is an endless stream of issues just coming at you the whole time.
Yeah.
And it is this thing of, we've got to choose. We'll in certain cases we'll just say nice words, and we'll just assume that fashion will move on, the next fad will come on. If we just wait it out, it'll take care of itself.
Right.
So it is common. Right. I'd say the most common one is what's called defensive engagement, or do what the lawyers say. And that is, we'll stick to, the legal requirements, because actually stepping outside of that creates pain. I was just thinking the head of INSEAD during the Gaza thing, sent out a fast letter. It was a well-intentioned, and he just got it in the neck from all sorts of things, and then had to send out another one. And it is this whole thing of, good intentions don't help in this arena. People just judge you, and you enter into this world of pain very quickly. So
what did the INSEAD man send out? What was the letter?
Well,
a position, presumably.
It was a positioning statement about, saying good words and basically trying to say INSEAD respects all these people and is concerned about, its alumni out there in the world. And it was just interpreted in a way that felt it was favored one group over another.
Right. Okay.
And that was the problem there. So the defensive engagement is the most common, and that is do what the lawyers say. And it's almost just stay with the herd, because you're not going to get hurt that way. Just look at what your competitors are doing and do something similar. I'm just, can you see any of the chat coming through, by the way, Dick, or not?
Just you keep talking.
I'll keep talking. Yeah. So the first four, the non-existent, suppression, facadism, and defensive engagement, are more or less the defensive. They're sort of the negative response. When we move over to the dialogic engagement and the stimulate activism, we're actually shifting in terms of the dial. So the dialogic engagement is the response of an issue arises, and it is something as an organization, we don't know about. And you as a senior leadership team say, I need to engage with people who do know about this inside and outside the organization. And this is, again, where things like if you've got a really good staff, good staff network system, this is where you can really tap into them. the thing that you have to avoid is using your staff networks as stooge armies, which is they're just brought in as soon as we've got an issue about race. We'll bring the race network in, and then you don't actually give them a meaningful voice. But if you're serious about this dialogic engagement is where senior leadership begin to realize that we need to engage with voices of difference. We need to hear different people to the ones we normally do, and that's a huge step forward. And the shift between defensive and meaningful dialogic engagement is night and day. And it is
to your point, John, and you can't engage on every topic, as you said, I think said under the facadism thing. Issues come at a rate of knots. There's always something we need to be talking about. Does engaging in that manner present a problem that you're just overloaded having dialogue about everything that crops up in the world, and all minority interests need to be discussed and explored and talked about? Is there a limit to that? How do people kind of draw a box around that? Or maybe they don't, maybe they just embrace it.
Well, this is where you get into the more that we have stripped away a multipolar. We've always had a multipolar system within organizations where unions used to be quite strong voices and there used to be other voices outside the executive team. The more we've centralized the decision making, the more that therefore that body is seen to be having executive responsibility for everything. Right. Whereas what it's maybe for a number of these issues, we need to start distributing power and authority so that when it comes to something blowing up around Black Lives Matters, is actually that the staff network around that speaks for the company on that one, and is and actually has executive authority. And again, that's shifting how power is distributed within the organization. Okay. Because the more that you try to say that one body should control everything, should control the single narrative, I mean, Megan and I have called it the impossible agenda, because suddenly you're meant to have a view on everything.
Right.
So so it is tricky. I just want to say, in order to keep cracking on, is the last one is the stimulate activism, and this is with Patagonias and these sorts of people. And these are sort of organizations who, if you go out on a demonstration, particularly in environmental areas, they'll pay your bail if you're arrested. They'll give you time off to go on marches and demos and that sort of things. They become, we are stimulating activism. We're going to be leading the agenda rather than responding to it. But they are choosing, a number of these organizations, this is the agenda area we're going to be in. So the environmental one is very strong. Right. I just want to say one thing on the environmental, is that if you are being a facadism on environmental matters at the moment, the environmental movement is coming out to get you. Because I'm just been tracking an international group, by and large younger people, and they are tracking any evidence of facadism in the environmental. Greenwashing is their big thing to go for. So be really, really wary there, because I don't really very comfortable with their tactics, but the environmental movement is really on
the intent is clear. Yeah. Okay. So stimulate activism looks like what? Companies picking issues that they corporately support.
So Patagonia is, they'll say, we are going to take active steps to be a proponent, stripping all carbon out of our supply chain. It used to be, on the human rights across the whole supply chain, LGBTQ rights across the whole supply chain. It's, thinking about your impact on society and we are going to be at the lead of this.
So that's a bit like the red and blue thing you talked about. You're starting to say what sort of company you are, what you support, and you take a very clear stance on that. And you're very happy for people to then be active around those particular topics. I guess it begs a question. There are other topics which clearly they're not looking at, which maybe haven't made their corporate agenda. So I guess they will then still face the same problems with those issues when they come up. Do they embrace all activism or just the ones they deem to be the right ones? But I don't know whether that came out at all, but there must be a line somewhere where we say, no, we're not going to embrace that. It can't be forever and ever.
Absolutely. And you still get it in the neck. I mean, there's one organization which stands for all sorts. It's a New York-based organization, and speaking to the exec team there, who all have these gorgeous, force for good in the world resumes, and they had because they employ very activist youngsters, who would go through their CVs with a fine tooth comb and would be on their neck the whole time. Leading an organization of activists it's
quite scary.
It's very scary.
Yeah. Okay. And can we talk a little bit about people maybe moving around this dial? Because I'm intrigued by certainly the Gaza stuff and obviously what we saw on the campuses in the US, and then we got some very hardline response from some of the universities and people being evicted and the police coming in, and it got complicated. And then they changed their positions from we support these initiatives to suddenly being much more neutral again, because actually whatever position it's almost like coming back to the fence and being apolitical. But I know you made the point, actually being apolitical is political in and of itself. And I'm struck by an example you quote around, I think, McKinsey's, who instructed their consultants in Moscow when there was trouble a few years back, in no way to be politically active on LinkedIn or social media. In other words, to be completely neutral. But of course, the signal it sent to the Russian regime was McKinsey endorses what we do, and there's no pushback. So doing nothing sent a signal as much as doing something. But do you see people moving around this dial from going, oh, we're going to embrace all this is the kind of company you are, to go, oh, that's a bit much, we need to kind of go neutral again? Because actually, and I'm really very struck by Harvard and other colleges who've sort of gone back to that, we can't really stray too far outside the safe middle ground here. So how do you read that from intentions to dealing with the reality of it?
Well, I'd say a lot of professional services firms have very strong provisos that you should do nothing to bring the firm into disrepute. And the question of what counts as bringing the firm into disrepute, it becomes quite problematic. In terms of moving around the dial, there is one, when Megan was presenting, I think it was at the Stern conference in Austria, it polled, the views of senior people, and then we compared it to the results of more junior people. And we find that senior people, by and large, have believe that their organizations tends to be at, the dialogic engagement.
Right. Field. That's what they'd like to think, or they think
what they think. That's what they believe their organization culture is like.
Right.
And if you talk to the more junior people, they will tend to find that they interpret their organizational culture as more as the defensive or facadism. And this might be, again, that there's a split between senior people's experience of they give instructions, they set policy, and they assume that it is therefore being executed. Whereas, of course, the people at the front line are the ones experiencing, but actually the lived experience of the policy has not changed. Okay. And you talked about organizations yo-yoing around. I don't think they do, because it's this idea that the corporate culture does not change that much. So I talked about the Google example as actually, as a culture, I'd say it's at the suppression end on any issues, because if I looked at its response to sort of women in tech, if I look at its issues on the Gaza, it's the
similar response.
Persisting thing. What you have seen, I'm trying to think. There are examples, and again, they are fairly well known. Places like Unilever are still pretty good on the dialogic, and they allow more space for difference and for the messiness. And of course, within the culture of we need to show strong leadership, dialogic leadership is a very different beast. It doesn't meet many of the more macho qualities. So you don't yo-yo around. If you have a good dialogic culture, you are going to engage well with issues as they come in at you. If you've got a suppression culture, that will also work probably quite well.
Right. So this, in a sense, is a manifestation, or the responses are probably a manifestation of the culture you have anyway. Yeah. So that begs the question: how aware are people of their dialogic culture? And I think you alluded to the optimism bubble maybe at the top, and people's lived experience further down potentially being different. Could we talk just a little bit? So this is from your research, and this is one of the key points you and Megan talked to, which is this idea that how you respond is actually a sort of a lifting of the veil to reveal your real speak up culture. How do we react when people say things who don't normally speak? So it begs questions about whose voices get heard, and also what are the topics that we will legitimately pay attention to. So talk a little bit about this, because obviously this taps into your work about the longer term work you've been doing with Megan around speaking truth to power, and who has a voice in an organization and who doesn't. So how did this sort of come out of the research, and how does it link to this topic?
Well, the bit that really, I just made a little note there that really stands out is the reliance on heroes, which comes down to whistleblowers in the Truth to Power. We rely on whistleblowers to keep our organization pure. And it's this idea of, so we are expecting usually the least powerful, least well-resourced people to stand up against, the institutional system, which is well-resourced.
Right.
And there is the emotional labor of complaining, of trying to shift an agenda. And
the risk.
And the risk. With the activism thing, we see particularly, I'm just thinking of a number of organizations where I saw people really banging the drum on the environmental front. You could see organizations relying on the heroic efforts of some individuals. And in a sense, it let everybody else off the hook. Oh, we don't really need to do it because Claire
we have
or
a task
John,
force. Yeah.
And I always think of it as a metaphor, because when I talk to activists, my main warning to them is, remember, you will burn out, because it's rather like it's the metaphor of the peloton, and it's this idea that if you just have one person at the front of a bicycling peloton, it's really hard work. And it is this whole notion of that you as an organization often benefit from the hard work of that, but you need to take care of those people.
Yeah, because they will burn out. Yeah,
they will burn out. And it actually, the most difficult role, and this, it draws on other work as well, is the position of the tempered radical, which is a slightly esoteric phrase, but they are the bridge between the activist out there on the street and the people in the boardroom keeping the business going. And the trouble is that the tempered radical gets shot by both sides.
Right. Not radical enough or too radical, depending on who's holding
you're a pain in the backside when you're in the executive meeting, because you keep on insisting on bringing up the environmental issues or the Black Lives Matters issues, and then with, from the eyes of the outsiders, they view, but look, you're there, you're colluding. And I have one particular story that I remember stuck with me a long time ago of someone I interviewed on this. This was for an educational institution, and they had a particular senior leader. One could say he was not of this time, and his statements about women could be easily labeled as very misogynistic. Anyway, she was there, part of the executive team, helping him leave with dignity. And she did not want him to leave with dignity, but for the sake of the institution, that was the compromise. Outside the room where they were making this decision, she could see all the alumni out there with the placards saying, "Hang this man out to dry." And she wanted to be out there, but she knew that in order for the institution to move on, for her standing and for able to go on influencing the agenda, and it is that murky grey world, and it's a really tough job. So look after your tempered radicals, is what I say.
Yeah. Okay. And that's a tough job for leaders, and I guess it because it's so nuanced, and I guess it begs the question about leaders needing to understand the dialogic culture that exists, and having a sort of way of dissecting that. And I know certainly in the talks I give, there's a lot of time spent on, well, how do we talk to each other? Exactly this question on the screen here. Who do we hear? Who do we not hear? Therefore, what do we hear? Therefore, what do we not hear? So it's some very interesting stuff to make people aware of. And I know you have a little thing around this, and I just wondered if it might be helpful for people just to understand how you use this, because this, again, I know it came out of research. It's an acronym, isn't it? I believe, active, but it's a way of starting to think about how this plays out in reality.
And so
Yeah.
this is again, this is a framing which is non-prescriptive throughout my work, is that this idea of how do you promote a conversation with an organization, within your organization, about this, because nobody can come in and give you the answer. And so this is where each of these particular labels are ways to help you frame an inquiry and help those around you pay attention to issues you don't often pay attention to. So if I'm looking at the A for authority, this is really about who has the right to speak up about something, who has the right to be heard. And it's the question of, well, what was right a few years ago, is that still right? And it also raises fundamental questions about how does power get exercised around here? And again, I was with a group yesterday, and this person said really didn't like using the word power and talking about power, because again, one of the challenges of all our research is that power has been disappeared. We keep on talking about flat organizations and all these things. It's not a helpful framing. And so when you, and it's to pay attention how power is actually used. And the two dimensions that we identify within the authority is, are you a power over culture, where broadly it is, a directive, people pay most attention to what is expected of them, and it's quite a compliant culture, which has a great strength, or are you a power with? And in power with, it's the understanding that this is a negotiation. You are actually, using the power in order to reduce power distance. And it's the question of, I'm just thinking of a particular example with a military commander who used to deliberately get driven around when he was touring the country in the car driven by the youngest cadet, which I always thought was quite scary anyway. And his point was that in the car, conversation, he said, whatever gets said in the car stays in the car, because he wanted to reduce the power distance. And he said, when you're with a young man or woman being driven around, they will start speaking and they will tell you things that you won't hear from anywhere else.
And certainly not in formal meetings.
And what he discovered was that if they said something that alarmed him, he couldn't identify them as a source. He had to think of another way. How else can I get this data? But it was the idea, and it is this whole notion of how do you, the different power with would be there's silence in the car, but power over it, there's silence in the car and you do exactly what the boss says. Power with is actually, we can actually have a generative conversation. And I know that you're going to trust what I say to you well. And you're going to trust to use what I say to you well. So that's the authority thing. So when it comes to issues, the next one is concern. How much does this really matter to people? And this ties back to the definitional challenge, which is activism is in the ear and eye of the beholder. It might not matter to you very much, but it might matter like hell to somebody else. I was in a group of sort of many different races were in the group yesterday. We had this brilliant conversation where one of the guys, an Irish guy, turned around to me and said, well, it sounds to me like you're just wokeism on steroids. And a Black American woman said, actually, what I think he's advocating is that someone like me should have a voice. And that's the tension. But I mean, it was brilliant. I mean, they as a pair in the group were able to sort of express and hear each other. And it was a very robust culture there. But that concern is, just because it doesn't concern you, doesn't mean it doesn't concern everybody else. But it also raises the issue of, collectively, is this something that we as an organization are going to, pin our credibility to? Does this make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
So that's the concern. The next one is the esoteric one. The theory of change. Whatever, every organization has a practice about how they think change happens. I'm not going to, there are millions of models out there about how this happens. And the point is that every organization has in practice, this is how things are made, how a difference gets made. And this is where you really have to engage with the politics of the organization. Who has what voice? And if you, as an activist, you've really got to pay attention to who can actually hear what I want to say. Where can I go and find a supporter for what I am standing for. And if
So
you
this
as
is
a
like
leader,
political skill on the
yeah,
behalf of the activists to say, how does this place work? Who has the informal networks? Who has power? Whose ear should I get because they can influence other people? Is that what you're meaning? It's just the
it's
informal way things get done almost.
well, it is the informal, and it's also, if you as the leader, it's the I've always, this is where you've got to realize I've always assumed that it happens like this.
Right.
And it's the
Okay.
idea that, well, maybe that doesn't. How do I find out? So I've got a really nice example. It was a paper I wrote up based upon the strategy process for WaterAid, which they did at the beginning of the 2020s. And they completely changed the theory of change around their strategy process. It was enabled through COVID. And traditionally, of course, strategy processes, you have very expensive strategists and they are the scarce resource, and you have to treat them as, make efficient use of them. WaterAid changed that on its head. They said the scarcest resource are the people leading out in the field, because they operate in about 40 countries. So we have to set up a process which connects into, makes it possible for them to contribute in a way that's efficient for them, not for the strategy people.
Right.
And it's a beautiful, right? It's in the European Business Review, and it's about how you tap into collective intelligence.
Okay.
That sort
Okay.
of thing. Apologies, my throat is dry. So the I is for the identity. And this is again at the individual level. It's, do you see yourself as coming from an activist tradition or not? And a lot of that comes from, whether you went out on demos, whether you are actually very used to or comfortable with rocking the boat. And
Right.
if you're, I've been brought up as a maverick since the age of whatever. So I would see myself as an activist voice. That's just comes easily to me. And it is this idea that it might be that you want to, if you are not an activist, it's to understand, how do I begin to appreciate people whose identity is wrapped up with it?
Right.
Their sense of self is part of this. And the last one, then I'm going to go and grab a piece of water, is the field. And that is to do with what is going on in the wider world. The point is, you cannot be immune to the changing social norms and what is custom and practice in the world, and therefore what you as an organization should pay attention to.
Okay. Grab some water very quickly before you croak. So I think, and when we talk with leaders, this idea of understanding and really digging into how things happen properly against these five aspects is a really interesting exercise to do, because it forces people to notice what is, and in particular what it forces people to do is to notice the silencing effect of power, and how power for many years does silence people, even if we think it doesn't, or it shouldn't, or we would like to think it doesn't, it does. So I think this thing, John, here that we're talking to is quite an interesting challenge to people. I'm also interested in the field one, which is the world changes, and what's an issue now wasn't an issue 10 years ago, and new Gazas will erupt and other things will come. Does that suggest people should very actively talk about trends, futurists, people who are out there just looking, scanning what's happening, so that it doesn't just creep up on you? Or have you come across companies or organizations that sort of very proactively scan the field, to use your word there?
Well, I think often, again, it was interesting the way you framed that, is the idea that we want to bring in experts to do the scanning and that sort of thing. If you're a reasonable sized organization, you've got all the futurologists you need.
And you've got them, they're working for you.
They're all walking through your door every time. And if you're, again, I do a lot of work in the NHS. The NHS does not need to do any future work. It's got its customer base are its employees. And it's this whole notion of, actually, again, going back to the Google example, it was, this was something that really exercised them. how do you continually tap into your best source of information, which is your employees? Because they're also your customers probably as well. They're the
Yeah.
ones who really know. And so the field is, we keep on thinking of course you want to get some interesting futurologists and things in there.
Yeah.
But often that tells you, if your instinctive reaction is, we need to get somebody expert in.
An expert, yeah.
And again,
well, that's something about the culture already, because you respect you respect that voice, but maybe not the voices of the people within.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the frustrating things that Megan and I have experienced is that we've gone into, particularly on the speaking truth to power thing, you'll go into talk to an executive team who's often calling us in to recovering from a scandal. I'm avoiding identifying who I'm talking about quite deliberately. And you look around the table and you see that, oh, you're all the same people.
Yeah.
And it's this idea of being brought, this is where the facadism kicks in again. And it's that you're not actually changing anything. You're not changing, if this orientation to where can I learn about the field is probably the question that I've now got to.
Right. And that kind of probably starts to draw us to a close a little bit, because this is a slide I love. And I certainly use with leaders in the talks I give around, leading in a modern world. This idea that you need to embrace the idea that challenging the status quo is inherently a risky thing to do, because you're challenging people who have benefited from it. And that enabling dialogue is, I always say, genuinely an act of leadership. It's genuinely something good leaders do. It doesn't mean you agree with everything that people say, but you are prepared to engage in a dialogue. So that's the sort of right-hand side of your dial, if you like. Can you talk to this slightly? Because it seems to me that's the nub of this. There are no answers to all these issues. There are, things will pop up and will continue to pop up. So maybe the only response is we need a way of talking, which is perhaps different from that in which we have talked previously. Is that how you see it, if you sort of try to boil it down a little bit?
Well,
I'm trying to be very simplistic, clearly. Here,
yeah, I know you want to boil it down, don't I?
Yeah, I love the boiling down bit, but
the thing that actually really come to my mind now is another piece of research which kicked off about a year ago into the seemingly nebulous subject of spaciousness and how do we create space in our work. And what we've done is collect some hard data around the type of conversations that people feel comfortable having. And this won't surprise you that people are most comfortable having conversations about task, getting things done.
Yeah.
What they say that they would like more time to do is to have conversations about meaning, values, what's going on in the world. And then you ask them, but are you willing to give up any of the time you currently spend on task conversations? And the answer is no. So what we've got is a very task-focused culture. And the idea is, of course, you need to have good task-focused conversations, but it's become a massively overplayed strength. And the trouble is, we like to stay with the things that we're competent at, because actually we're not that skilled, because we don't practice it very much, about having conversations about meaning, about having conversations about relationships, in the workplace. How do you have something that really gets quite personal, because you can see every sort of policy department kind of head the thing. So how do we talk about different things? How do we create the space for it? And a lot of people then come back and say, we're too busy. We can't possibly do this.
Curse of busyness, yeah.
And I had a lovely thing. So Megan was giving a talk at a European pharma company. I think it was a European company of some note. And the chief executive had it, after she'd given her keynote, had it all his, top 300 managers. And he said, actually, most of us, if we looked in our diaries, we could strip 30% out. Well, let's be honest. In terms of if we got rid of a certain round of reporting. And it's how do we get honest about what we are choosing not to do? And it is so much easier to choose to be busy, because it means we can stick with tasks. It means that we can stick with doing the things we know how to do.
Yeah.
It means that we don't have the more existential conversations that, conversations about activism ask us, which is, what are we for? What's our role in society? How's that changing?
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And I know if people are interested in this research, John and Megan are running it now, and by all means reach out and find out more. I think it's the natural extension of all of this stuff, which is to say, unless there is time to talk, these things will remain very complicated and slightly unaddressed and lurking in the corner, and then they become crises, and then they force themselves center stage, and we have to respond in a reactive way rather than proactive. But I can't I've lost count of the number of times people say we don't have time to talk. We just don't have time to talk, and it's a sort of a weird and maybe sad indictment of the world we've created and how we interact and what we value and what we don't value. And I think that's built into our private lives. And so this is probably a societal wide phenomenon. I'm very aware of the time, and I'm sure some of you will have 9:30 meetings to get to. So I'm going to try and start wrapping this up. John, say what if this is of interest to people, point them somewhere. What else could we do? Obviously we love talking about all this stuff, as I hope you can tell. You've alluded to the research you're doing, which is about the spaciousness. Anything else you want to say by way of wrapping up or kind of pulling this together for us?
Oh yes, you should buy the book. That was, yes, we got the second edition of the Speak Up book is now out. Speak Out. In terms of promoting that, it's still, endorsed by Amy Edmondson, who Megan is now doing a lot of work with, and she, of course, is the grandmother, although she didn't originate the phrase, but she is, associated with the whole notion of psychological safety, and that is right at the root of making it safe to talk. So we're proud of that, and there's lots of things if you go to our various websites and you look on the thing. But have a look at the book. That would be my prime thing. And I'm just thinking,
So sum up in a sentence, kind of where we are with this whole thing. If you've met a lot of people, you've talked to a lot of people, you've thought about this a lot, you've read a lot. Kind of, if in a nutshell, where have you landed today, or you and Megan?
Well, I can start with one esoteric thing, which is to really pay attention. There's a great guy called David Bohm who came up with the phrase, thought creates the world and then denies it. How we think about the world affects what we do it, and we don't pay enough attention to the headwaters of our thinking. That's one thing. And at the headwaters of our thinking is the fridge magnet thing, which is drink coffee, do more stupid things faster. And it is the thing that we are drinking a lot of coffee in all its forms. And we don't know how to pause, because to pause, to take time to reflect, has become viewed as a pointless activity. And actually, I will finish with this is the synopsis, which is the head of learning and development for one of the world's biggest companies joined us in our inquiry group. And she said that when people come on any of her courses, it is put in their spreadsheet, their timesheets, as non-productive time. Learning equals non-productive time. And she said she feels really proud. Her job is to be head of non-productive time. When you think about how have we got to that as a phrase?
Yeah. On that bombshell, I think we should end. Listen, John, thank you so much.